International IDIA, and all other partners to initiate this dialogue with the critical stakeholders that you are all. More importantly, as mentioned earlier, we also believe that there is a need to revisit some of the electoral management bodies, especially looking at the baseline, because we have different terms of presidential terms, elongation, those kind of issues. And that was why ECOWAS, at ECOWAS level, we tried to revisit the treaty as well as the mechanism and the supplementary protocol. Finally, it is my hope that this event will prompt new thinking on how best to address the challenges of electoral democracy and lead to the consolidation of democratic governance in the region and on the continent at large. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have no doubt that with the quality of discussants at this dialogue, the topics of discussion during the various sessions will be thoroughly covered. On this note, therefore, I wish us all a fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Edward. At least for the reassurance of the commitment to support really democratic governance, of which elections is simply a means. I now have the pleasure to introduce Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who is the Africa and West Asia Regional Director of the International.
Who became the first African to be named Under Secretary General Political Affairs at the United Nations. This is not considering that some of the key positions of Under Secretary General at the United Nations are usually reserved for the big boys. The big boys, you know them, the United States, the United Kingdom, China nowadays, France, and of course Russia. And Professor Gambari was able to break through the class ceiling and to become the first African to occupy that exalted position. Let me also thank and at the same time welcome Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, colleague and friend, going back to our student days in Oxford and beyond. Thank you also for hosting us and for co-organizing this with us through the INEC Electoral Institute, led by Dr. Abubakar Momo. I'd like to thank Hidayat and also Hidayat's mentor, Dr. Jibril Ibrahim, who was also a student of Professor Gambari at the CDD, for your very close collaboration with us in organizing this. And of course, Dr. Rene Adibera, also a friend going back to our student days in the UK. You mentioned your teacher at the London School of Economics. When we were in Ahmadu Bello University first year, we went into the big lecture theater, and the various heads of departments were addressing the new cohorts of students. And first, with all of the excitement, you came in and said to us, amongst many other things, Alexander Pope, for forms of government, let fools contend. Whatever is administered best is best. And that was our first assignment. We were supposed to go back and reflect on this, and in the next class to come back and interpret what Alexander Pope meant. Alexander Pope was, of course, one of the most distinguished poets of his era, and many of the things he had to say about the times resonate even today, which might itself be a commentary on the way in which global affairs have evolved over time, in which we seem to move in cycles in the experience of humankind, appearing to transcend an era only to return to that same era with a slightly different context in place. But today, I think so many people thinking of the state of elections and electoralism, not just in Africa but around the world, might cynically be tempted to conclude that at the end of the day, what matters most is that things are administered correctly and rightly. Right? For forms of government, let fools contend. Whatever is administered best is ultimately best. And the movement has indeed grown in places like the UK, which describes itself as the good enough movement, which basically says that the struggle for ideals, which has characterized in many respects the nature of politics in many parts of the world, is one which is almost a fruitless struggle. So what we need to do is to define a certain minimum content for what is good enough and strive to push that agenda of what is good enough. I reflect on all of these from Alexander Pope to the good enough movement in the context of our meeting. And I kind of feel, almost to paraphrase you again, Professor Gambari, about blowing your own trumpet. I almost feel that, in a sense, it's something which we cannot afford in Africa. Because in many ways, looking at our history, where other people have reached a certain summit in the pursuit of their ideals, find a stable set of ideals for ourselves around which we can then begin to build an ambition. Cannot expect anybody to be ambitious for them. And the challenge of electoralism on our continent goes beyond what other regions of the world may be contending with today, even as they grapple with their crisis of electoralism. And there is no doubt about it, that all over the world, democracies appear to be in serious trouble. Citizens from Spain in the Hidalgo movement, in Paris, what do they call themselves, to stay out every night, occupy the streets at night, and light up the streets in protest about everything going wrong. Yeah, that's right, the night on the streets. Right? In Austria, where the elections just took place, a neo-fascist, effectively, almost nearly becoming president of the country, of an international order in which basic values of solidarity that defined the post-war system appear to be unraveling, of the United States that is faced with the real prospect of having a Trump as president of that country. And what started as an act of buffoonery, really, real buffoonery, becomes a serious proposition which we all have to contend with. So yes, there is a crisis of electoralism around the world. But for us in the African continent, our concerns are even deeper because we still need to build the stable political community around which we can begin to try to construct a set of ideals for ourselves and build our ambition behind those ideals. And if the world is to experience any innovation in the electoral system and in the performance and principles of democracy, I think perhaps we offer the best fertile ground for such creative and original thinking to take place that will propel us to new forms of administering the Commonwealth on our continent and hopefully in other regions of the world. So insofar as elections are concerned, we've done very well in copying what has happened everywhere else in the world. We've done very well. We've been very good students in that regard. Every system that exists elsewhere in the world has been reproduced in our continent. We've even gone one step further, because I think we are probably among the very few people in the world who use transparent ballot boxes. Right? For which somebody in Europe is holding the patent. I was actually threatening to sue our own INEC because we didn't pay them the commission for using a transparent ballot box. So conventional electoralism, we've not done badly, but we still feel a certain lack of satisfaction. We feel a certain lack of satisfaction, which I think, as previous speakers have said, could be summarized in part as amounting to a situation in which increasingly we vote as a ritual without necessarily choosing. It's a Claude Aki expression. It says voting without choosing. And our democratization increasingly is becoming a process of mass disempowerment. insofar as you exercise the vote, and if you are lucky, it is a free vote. You wait in the cooler for the next 4 years until you are called upon again using different formula, stomach infrastructure, non-stomach infrastructure, all of those things that come to play. That's where your relevance is, and at the end of the process, you are put in the cooler again. Mass disempowerment, going side by side with the process of voting without choosing. On top of this is an infrastructure in which, at least for our continent, key pillars of decision-making remain confiscated by the international community. I'm sorry to include the United Nations in this also. I worked for the UN also for 6 years, and I am loyal to the ideals of the UN. But the process of confiscation of key policy-making instruments from the African continent, such that irrespective of who we elect at the helm of our affairs, we all end up implementing the same social and economic policies. Can we beat that? Citizens are told during campaigns by politicians who I believe are genuine that they are going to do A, B, C, D when they are elected into office. They get elected into office. Election managers do their best to ensure that the elections are free and fair, deliver with integrity, and when people get into office, they find that they actually have no choice on important swathes of policy making. Exchange rate, trade policy, macroeconomic policy, those key determinants that ultimately cascade into what we will call the everyday experience of the people. And here again, we are faced with a situation in which at the lower level, citizens vote without choosing, and at the macro level, elected officials are called upon to preside over choiceless democracies. It's little wonder that too many of our politicians appear to be so inconsistent that those who say that yesterday they will never do something of a policy type, except over their dead body, become the people who come to implement exactly what they say they will never do. And you find this repeatedly, creating a situation of disconnect and distrust between citizens and their political leaders, of citizens who become very cynical about the politicians. And it is true, all over the world, perhaps the most unpopular people are the politicians. The people whom citizens will say they trust the least in all polls that are taken in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere are politicians. But in our particular context, we know that the inability of our elected government to deliver effectively to the citizenry is partly because their hands, they go into office with their hands tied in key policy areas. Now, this becomes even more worrisome at the third level when we begin to think about the conceptualization of the nature of contemporary politics that has accompanied the neoliberal revolution in the international system. And no one has expressed this more clearly and directly than Larry Summers, former chief economist at the World Bank, former big shot at the National Treasury, was actually secretary to the Treasury for a period under the Clinton administration, former president of Harvard University, somewhere at large between New York and Washington nowadays, but still in the policy circles. And Larry Summers wrote an editorial which perhaps deserved to be given much more publicity than before. And he said basically, in summary, that we economists know what we need to do in order to make an economy work. We know what we need to do in order to grow an economy. What we don't know how to do yet, and which we must find a solution for, is how to make democracies respect sound macroeconomic policy making. Excuse me. If democracies are to respect sound macroeconomic policy making, And if by sound macroeconomic policy we mean the Washington Consensus, it means that you masses feel free to elect whoever you like. Because at the end of the day, these guys must come and implement sound macroeconomic policy. And that sound macroeconomic policy has been predefined in advance and presented to us as something which I think, Professor Gambari, you are the one who said it again in the context of Nigeria and the IMF, where you are foreign minister, in which basically we are told that there is one size that fits every nation of the world. One size for every nation of the world. What United States implements or purports to implement, because it's a case of really do what I say, not what I do, must also be the same thing that a country like Benin or Nigeria must implement. And here I think is where we are faced with a dilemma of a dictatorship of macroeconomic policy, a dictatorship of macroeconomic policy that saps the life out of politics and renders elections completely meaningless on an increasing scale around the world. And it is to this challenge, I believe, that we must also address our minds. It is not so much, in my view, at this point in time, a question anymore of simply how to make elections free and fair, but also, importantly, as Mahmoud Yakubu just said, to make sure that elections matter, and that they matter simply beyond the ritual of it, to translate into an instrument and a means for enabling our countries to drive programs of transformation. If we do elections and at the end they are free and fair and we proclaim that the operation was successful but the patient died, what will be the point of having had that election? Wouldn't it have been better to save the patient in the first place and hope that later you can then feed them elections in order to make them more healthy? And the point, therefore, about how we make elections become part of a broader strategy of development and transformation on our continent appears to be the agenda we are confronted with today. So, sir, over the next day and a half, we will discuss all of the problems associated with election on our continent. The discontents of electoralism, some of which have been identified already. Some of the progress which we have made, but above all else, we must answer the question at the end of our deliberations of how elections can become instruments of transformation and full citizenship on our continent. If not, as you also said in our first class in international relations, second year Ahmadu Bello University, elections will become like international relations. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
If you thought that Professor Matlosa was very radical towards the end of his speech, then there's a higher level of radicalism. But really, it's not so much radicalism, really, but realism. Bio is very clear that if we as a people cannot be ambitious for ourselves, in terms of where we want to be, not where we are, but where we want to be, we cannot expect others to be more ambitious for us. And that's why if you look at peace and security in Africa, if we don't take seriously the challenges of peace and security, nobody will do it for us. We've seen it in West Africa. Without ECOMOG, there would probably be no Sierra Leone or Liberia today. But we did it. And if you look at it more recently in Mali, Central Africa, unless the Africans themselves, decide to go there, put boots on the ground in Somalia, the rest of the world cannot do it for us. There is a Ghanaian proverb that you can do everything for somebody who is sick to make him better. You can wash him, you can massage him, but there's one thing you cannot do for him to get better. You cannot take his medicine for him. So therefore, we Africans must take our own medicine in terms of democracy, in terms of peace and security, in terms of development. And Bio was pointed out the crisis of electoralism And that, yes, we may get it right in terms of conventional electoralism, but then we will then have what Brother Ake quoted him as saying, voting without choosing. But if, as Professor Mahmoud Yaku said, the people's votes must count. But there are two ways in which those votes can count. One is that the people who actually claim victory reflects the wish of the people. But above all, their vote must count in terms of a change, a material change for better in their conditions and their aspirations for a good life for themselves, for their children, and for their children's children. So thank you very much for Lukushi. I cannot be more proud that I was in any small way associated with your academic a lot of work, a lot of close, with the consent of the organizers, so that we'll just take a very short break, and then the keynote address will come immediately, so that you'll be fresh, having been refreshed with tea and coffee to listen to the keynote address. So we just, with the dictatorship of the chairman, and times before, I'll get a copy of your paper, but I'm sure we will reach discussion after.
To be asked to introduce our keynote speaker for this meeting, Professor Okechukwu Ibam, who is listed officially on the program as former Chief Technical Advisor to INEC, to Professor Atayu Jega of the Itos Commission. But Professor Ibam has been an associate professional colleague and friend for a long period of time, graduating from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. He was the outstanding graduate of his year at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and proceeded also to take a doctorate teaching at the university, rising to become a full professor of political science, and in between all in Geneva for a period of time before coming back home and taking on the task of being the chief technical advisor, both in the form of contemporary Nigeria election management, and he considered to be one of the most significant results in Nigerian elections following the election of President Muhammadu Buhari, and with it the first sitting president in Nigeria's history to be voted peacefully out of office, more or less peacefully out of office, and an elected president from the opposition taking the helm. I think we are particularly fortunate to have you okay as our keynote speaker, because in addition to your own work as an academic on the subject of African governance, and your contribution has been immense in this regard. You have also the advantage, which I think many of us don't have, of having been an insider and who got the opportunity to marry what we know in theory with what actually happens in reality, as to be able to share with us a unique perspective on election management on our continent. And so, with your permission, Chairperson, I would like now to invite Professor Okeyingam to share with us his thoughts on the theme of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I actually reflecting on the welcome remarks. They are so lucid that I'm beginning to wonder if you really require a keynote address. Bio was in full swing, as was Matlusa, and Professor Gambari and Professor Yakubu they were so lucid and profound that I could have just sat down, taken notes, and then regurgitated what they said as the keynote. But since I've spent some time writing this, I think it is only fair that I punish you a little bit by sharing my thoughts really about this very important issue. I have given this what I hope will be a provocative title, and that is making the best of the second best. And I want to commence actually by giving a one-sentence summary of my keynote. And that is to say that electoral democracy in Africa is only a second best. And the best we can do is try to make the best of it. Electoral democracy in Africa is only a second best, and the best we can do is to try to make the best of it. I think really that in a sense encapsulates what I'm going to say today. Yes, electoral democracy in Africa today is really about making the best of a next best alternative. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go into my favorite stylized history of democracy in Africa. And I'm going to argue that what we are actually going through is the third democratic movement in Africa. Now, this must be completely separated from the Huntingtonian third wave democracy. I'm talking about the third democracy movement in Africa. The first movement, I think, was the movement against colonialism, which in itself was a major struggle for democracy by Africa's people. However, in the first few years of the 60s decade, after that first movement resulted in independence, it became absolutely clear to the people of Africa that that democracy that we won, which was essentially one of liberal democracy, multi-party electoral democracy, could not satisfy the democratic aspirations of Africans. And so, almost immediately after independence, the second democracy movement in Africa began, although it was not continent-wide, but it had taken roots in many African countries in what was then called the second independence movement. And I think the timeless words of Nzongola Ntalaja will be very appropriate here. The picture he paints, which I completely agree with, is that for African people, independence was meaningless without a better standard of living, greater civil liberties, and the promise of a better life for their children. Instead of making these promised benefits available to the masses, the politicians who inherited the state lived in much greater luxury than most of their European predecessors and used violence and arbitrary force against the people. For the latter, the first or nominal independence had failed. Their discontent with the neo-colonial state served as a basis for an aspiration towards a new, genuine independence, one that the 1964 insurrection in Zaire was to incarnate. These are the words of one of, I think, one of Africa's best political scientists, actually, summarizing the failure of the democracy that we won with independence, and the reaction of people, of Africa's people, in calling for a new movement to democracy. And so my point really is that that second movement was almost again immediately hijacked, and it ended up in a series of military regimes and autocratic governments, which we had to endure for another 30 years. And in the 90s, Africa began its third pro-democratic movement towards democracy, which yielded what we have presently. Now, remember that I said that this, my stylized history of democracy in Africa, must be completely distinguished from the third wave, as Huntington tried to describe. And my reason for saying so is not to deny that global influences had anything to do with Africa's quest in the 1990s for democracy, but instead to argue that there was indeed an original movement within the African continent for democratization, which perhaps global forces influenced in one way or the other. But unlike those who have argued that that influence was necessarily positive, I will argue that in fact, having been incorporated into the third wave, so to speak, that global movement, the original African democratization process in the 90s actually became demeaned and devalued. And that is where I am going to start my argument. And I've made this point several times, that there was indeed an original African movement in the 70s and the 80s, which was hijacked, which became caught up in the third wave, actually. And this is not very difficult to see. All the struggles against structural adjustment, the students' movement, the labor movement, and even, indeed, some progressive political movements in the military. Now, each time I have said this, people have said, there you go again, trying to romanticize military rule. But that is not true. The point, what comes to mind will be the Sankaras of this world, okay? Will be the liberation armies and the governments they put in place after the victories in Mozambique, in Angola, and so on, at least initially. And so, the point really was that this initial movement was hijacked and demeaned. And one very critical manifestation of that demeaning of the original African movement for a third African democratic movement was the way in which democracy was emptied of its economic content. I think that's probably the most critical demeaning that third African democracy movement suffered. Because as a result of the powerful international forces such that Bayo was talking about this morning, it was inevitable that this would happen. And Claude Ake, again, masterly summarizes this, that if you look at all the people who were interested, at least all the groups who were interested in that movement in the 1990s, they were not all necessarily committed to democracy. Okay? They included disgruntled politicians who were looking at a way of getting back. They included Western governments who saw in democracy a means of universalizing the Western way of life. But perhaps most importantly, it also involved Africa's peoples as well. But in the light of the powerful global forces that had become part of this process, it became inevitable that that democracy will be emptied of the original intent of the Africa's people, which is to argue that there is really no point about democracy if it cannot deliver consistently improved quality of life. I think that's really the point. And so, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I think what then happened was that Africa not only lost the second independence movement, it lost the third democracy movement. It did not only lose the second independence movement, it lost the third democracy movement. So I argue that what was then left is what we have today, which is electoral democracy. And so you can understand when I say that this is the next best, the second best, and the only thing we can do is to try and make the best of it. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, how we have tried to make the best out of a second best. So to me, it's quite obvious that what is left of that third democracy movement in Africa is essentially a petit bourgeois project in the form of multi-party electoral democracy. Now again, I'm sure some of my friends will say, there you go again, you know. But I think that progressive scholarship in Africa, I think, was rather hasty in abandoning what I consider, you know, some of its best theoretical expose of the African state, you know, in the 70s and the 80s. And that is essentially to link African politics and economy to the expansion of global capital, and particularly the interests of the petit bourgeoisie. And I think that we were perhaps too hasty. And it includes things like inordinate competition to control power, the pervasiveness of the state, even if it flaunts to practice a market economy, the use of the institutions of state for private and sectional gains, the parceling out of the state agencies and institutions to individuals. African politicians and political parties lack ideology and things like that. My response is that they are actually steeped in ideology, but they are steeped in petit bourgeois ideology. The tendency, for example, to manipulate identity, okay, for our political gains is consistent with the character of a class that is only an auxiliary in the production and only relates, you know, to the economy in externality. So what I would then try to do is to see if I can paint a picture of the consequences and the results of petit bourgeois democracy in Africa. And I will argue, ladies and gentlemen, that we have had a very mixed outcome in the practice of petit bourgeois democracy. So what are the effects of this on democracy? What are the losses and gains? And what are the emerging trends? And many others are negative and debilitating. And I'm going to outline about 11. The economy has always played a second fiddle. And I think that, you know, this inherent tendency in the kind of democracy that we have, you know, to empty democracy of its economic and developmental content has been a major tragedy of the practice of this democracy Moreover, as democracy in Africa becomes more and more expensive in the face of underperforming and highly skewed economies, poverty has widened, as has the gap between the rich politicians and their families on the one hand, and the people on the other. And I think that this fundamentally shakes the confidence of citizens in democracy. Clearly, under the prevailing democracy in Africa, the political elite simply help themselves to the enormous resources controlled by the state. And if there's anything that democracy has failed to curb in Africa, I think it is this insatiable tendency to corral the resources of the country for personal use. So, for example, in Nigeria, huge sums of money, which some estimate at about $20 billion, accruing from crude oil sales, have not been accounted for. And you can eliminate Nigeria, replace Nigeria with any other country, and you will have practically the same effect. Recent information from Ghana also suggests that, for example, it's a petroleum sector which they did so much, and they tried to learn so much about what was wrong with Nigeria so that they avoid becoming like Nigeria, seems to have failed, and they seem to have gone exactly the way of Nigeria from what we're there. Second, excessive fractionalization of the petit bourgeoisie, particularly along ethnic, religious, and other primordial lines, leaves citizens constantly divided. Ethno-religious and regional political parties have become the hallmark of this democracy in Africa. And this is conducive to violence, particularly during elections. Thirdly, I think that the weakness of democratic institutions in Africa means that they are not in any case robust enough to produce